One, two, three.
And personally speaking, that is the last time I ever ate a bat. Hello, welcome to the Stray Thoughts podcast. It's lovely to see you here. This is Stray Theatre's show all about the Auckland art scene, coming at you in lockdown, evidently. It's a weird time, let's be honest, and especially for a show about theatre and the performing arts. However, we're going to do something a bit different this week. We thought that given lockdown has hit New Zealand quite abruptly again, rather than doing an episode focused on one individual show, we would do an episode talking generally about how theatre and plague has interacted throughout history. So to get a bit of perspective about the time we're in at the moment and what that means a bit more broadly speaking. As always, I am your host, Sam, and joining me today is a wonderful, wonderful guest. Tom, how about you introduce yourself?
Hello, Sam. Welcome. Thank you for having me on your show. I'm Tom Bishop. I teach English and drama at the University of Auckland, mostly Shakespeare, but also anything before and after that I can insinuate myself into, all the way through recent clown performances and stretching back sometimes to classical literature when I get the chance.
Well, it is absolutely fantastic to have you on the show, Tom. I know that in the Auckland uni drama scene, you are venerated like some kind of divine entity. So it is fantastic to have you on.
Oh, shucks.
For the first time, this is the first time we're trying to record this. Just this once. Okay, so we'll jump straight into it, I think. And the first question I have is based around, at least, it's a meme that I saw last year that drove me absolutely up the wall every time I saw it, which is did you know that Shakespeare wrote King Lear while in lockdown for the plague? What have you done this year? And I just wanted to first get a wee little fact check on first, is that true? And as a follow-up, in your professional opinion, when can we expect to see the next King Lear written? It's got to be sometime soon. Right?
Well, I'll take the first one of those, Sam. I might punt the second one. Well, 16th century and early 17th century England didn't really have lockdown. They did impose some travel restrictions on cities where the plague had broken out, but they didn't lock whole communities down into their houses the way that we do. However, when the plague deaths in London went over a certain level per week, which was their metric for monitoring outbreaks of plague, they did shut public venues like theatres and markets and so on. So it's not unlikely that Shakespeare wrote a number of plays during the extended plague outbreak of 1605, 1606, among them probably King Lear. The earliest recorded performance we have of King Lear was a court performance, which may indeed have been the first actual performance of the play. We don't know. The records are very patchy. It's quite likely that he did do writing during plague suspensions when the playhouses were closed. His company at this stage of his career was sufficiently well moneyed and supported by patrons that they could afford to suspend public performances and continue to do their theatre work, as it were, in the background. Earlier in his career, in the early 1590s, in 1592, for instance, when the theatre closed the playhouses for a similarly extended period of time, a number of the companies had to go on regional tour, and one of them, either Derby's or Pembroke's, I can't remember which, actually did so poorly on tour that they went bankrupt and had to sell their playbooks and their costumes and get themselves back to London as best they could because they were all starving to death. That didn't happen later on in his career when his company was more established and he himself had other sources of income, including patronage income. So probably not during lockdown as such, but that was quite a long suspension of time that the theatres were closed. And he, on average, wrote about 2 plays a year. So it's quite likely that he did work on King Lear. King Lear doesn't include any episodes of plague. Very few of his plays do.
I was going to say that to me, like anytime I've heard that, it's always sort of stood out to me. Like I can understand the idea that I think everyone watching this can understand the idea that plague times bring out some really powerful emotions in you, and that might serve as a conduit for
Yeah.
a play that's like as emotional as King Lear. But if you compare it to some of the other stuff we see from around that time, it does seem to me like King Lear is the one that written in Plague. I'm not sure, like it's there in the text really.
There are a number of references in the play to plague afflictions, and Lear not just once calls down plague suffering on his unruly daughters. All the plagues that in the pendulous air hang fated all men's faults light on thy daughters, he says at one point. And he calls a pestilence down on Goneril and accuses her of being a plague sore in his corrupted blood. So there's a kind of plaguey, miasmic atmosphere to the play, but no actual plague. The only play I can think of that has an actual outbreak of plague in it is Romeo and Juliet, where it's crucial to the plot. Friar Lawrence's messenger to Romeo telling him that Juliet's death is a fake gets shut up in a plague house, and the message never gets through to Romeo, which is why he comes back to Verona thinking that she's dead, and unfortunate scenes ensue. But apart from that, off the top of my head, I didn't check closely. The one endemic and perhaps even pandemic disease that does turn up not infrequently is syphilis, which is rampant in Measure for Measure and also in Pericles. Pericles is a play that was probably also written in a slightly later pandemic suspension episode in 1608. And there, plague-like suffering occurs twice, once a famine in one city and then again in another city. The brothel keepers that the young girl Marina is lodged with complain that they're out of trade because all of their working girls are diseased with syphilis. So there's a sense of pandemic disease, but not always plague of the kind that we're currently going through.
Yeah, and I like that you sort of brought it into more like pandemic adjacent stuff as well. Because one thing that has kind of struck me, I love, by the way, that even we totally didn't film this before, and that totally doesn't make me look clever bringing up stuff that you yourself brought up. But it does strike me that
did we do this before, Sam? I don't.
Nonsense,
remember.
of course not. But if we had, it would give me all sorts of clever stuff I could say. But it does strike me that going back, even though Shakespeare touches on some pandemic adjacent stuff, the idea of pandemic specifically and plague as a dramatic device has been going on for centuries, if not millennia, going back to ancient Greek theatre and stuff like Oedipus Rex. And so I guess I would ask that, do you think we see this continual theme of pandemic and plague throughout human history as a dramatic device? Do you think that's because plague is something that we so often live through and that we are just relating to what's around us? Or do you think it's fair to say that there is something special about plagues from an emotional sense that lets us get some new kind of nuance into theatre there?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and a complicated one. You're quite right to cite Sophocles' Oedipus as a play
that I definitely knew that off the top of my head.
Initiated by plague, and which also reflects the fact that probably about 4 years earlier, Athens had suffered a terrible outbreak of plague at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. We don't know what it was. It was probably a kind of typhoid or typhus plague, because the initiating circumstance seems to have been the crowding of the entire population of Attica inside the city walls of Athens. But clearly that was a highly emotive moment for the Athenian audience, where the chorus of the people of Thebes come forward and say, we're dying in large numbers. Why is this happening? And then, of course, Oedipus says that he sent a messenger to the oracle, and that messenger comes back saying, the murderer of the previous King Laius is still living in the city undetected, and that's why the plague has been visited on you. So it becomes the driving emotional impetus for the urgency with which the entire apparatus of Oedipus's undoing unfurls. Plague as an agent tendency of narrative as a driver of narrative goes all the way back to the beginning of the Iliad, of course, where Achilles begs the god Apollo to punish the Greeks for having injured him in his honor. And Apollo comes clanking down Mount Olympus with his arrows at his back. That's literally what the text says, and starts shooting plague arrows into the Greek camp.
Yeah, the Greek god Apollo couldn't do anything a bit more graceful than with arrows clanking at his back. That's
no,
really
it's actually in Homer. It talks about the arrows rattling as he comes down the mountain. He gets closer and closer. I think it's meant to be quite ominous that these are plague arrows. But your larger question is a very good one and a very interesting one. The one thing about plague is, of course, that it creates a massive society-wide convulsion, which is often the background to and the initiating impulse for a more local kind of tragic event. So I mentioned syphilis a moment ago. The syphilis plague at the end of the 19th century is manifested in Ibsen's Ghosts as representing the moral and political rot that middle-class hypocrisy has inflicted on the Alving family in the previous generation and in the current one. At the end of that play, you'll recall the young Oswald Alving falls victim to syphilis himself, and he ends up lapsing into a syphilitic trance coma at the end of that play. So plague is often taken into plays as representing something about the world of the play or the world of the characters, which is not specifically pathogenic, but rather as moral or political or psychological or something else. The one exception that I could think of to that in thinking through the topic was there's a typhus outbreak in Chekhov's Uncle Vanya, which seems to be only a typhus outbreak. That Dr. Astrov is treating patients with it, and it gives us some insight into the sort of person that he is, but it doesn't seem to stand for anything larger. In the 20th century, the French theatre theorist Antonin Artaud, actually said that theatre was itself a plague. In a very interesting essay, he talks about theatre has to be emotionally and psychologically and existentially contagious in order to work. It has to be like a plague fever that goes through the audience, that convulses them and pushes them out of the settled bourgeois state that they were in when they came in. He was reacting to and vehemently polemicizing against the kind of boulevard sort of middle-class farce or problem play theatre that he saw on the French stages of his youth, by mobilizing extreme images for what theatre was supposed to do to its audience in the way of totally changing, turning upside down and scrambling their lives. And his principal image for that was that theatre was a plague, which I forgot to mention in a previous iteration, but is actually very, very urgent and exciting.
This is our first time. This is our first time doing this, Tom. There was no previous iteration.
He may have had in mind, though, I think not, I'd have to look at the dates, but Albert Camus, the existentialist writer, wrote a novel called La Peste, the plague, which is about a terrible outbreak of bubonic plague in the North African town of Oran. And it catalogues how different people in that city reacted to it, how people tried to get out and break the quarantine, how people developed large fortunes on the black market, dealing in contraband goods and so on. That was actually made into a play quite recently in 2017, which I haven't seen, possibly prophetically. It would be very interesting to look at that now, 4 years later, in the middle of and after a major convulsive pandemic, to see what that fiction looks like put on the stage.
Yeah, I mean, I really like this point that you're making about how plague as a narrative device is a way of kind of taking a big conflict and using it to look not really just at individuals, but at the society more broadly and reflecting society. I mean, to me, the first thing that jumps to my mind is how a lot of art we've seen in recent decades about the HIV and AIDS crisis has been used to make broad comments about the LGBTQ rainbow community. Yep. I mean, the name I can't remember what it's called, Lockdown Brain, but the recent Russell T Davies series, which followed the this is gonna kill me. I can't remember what it's called. Normally I do this, but no, Lockdown.
No, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, well, there was a recent TV
Fine.
series.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, by Russell T Davies. It was about the HIV/AIDS epidemic in London at the a few decades back, and it was very much trying to tell a story of the rainbow community in the UK.
Yeah,
And I find it interesting what you said, that maybe plague stories about disease and plague are really good at those kind of deep, insightful looks at societies more broadly, or social groups more broadly.
yeah. Well, that's what Camus was trying to do in La Peste, which is still a novel very much worth reading. I think of the kinds of things that happen to the dramaturgy that he was exploring in Tony Kushner's Angels in America, which begins looking like a fairly standard Broadway play of its era, with a series of fairly realistic, kind of bitterly comic, ironic scenes about, you remember it begins with Walter and his lover talking about a funeral that he'd just been to, and then but as it goes on, the texture, the kinds of things that happen, the way in which things happen on the stage become increasingly deformed and exaggerated and even violent, so that the dramaturgy itself is kind of overtaken by the urgency of this situation and the kind of convulsive effect that it's having on that community, until famously at the end of the first half, Millennium approaches, the ceiling of the bedroom erupts and this huge angel descends in a maximum of special effects, and the line is, he's lying in bed, he looks up at the angel, he says, "Oh, very Steven Spielberg," he says, so that the theater has kind of absorbed the industrial light and magic ability to transform and put pressure on its own procedures. And I think of that, and Kushner's talked about this, that what was going on around him was so convulsive and so disturbing and so fracturing that he felt that he couldn't simply write an ordinary play. He had to write a play which was itself convulsed and fractured and turned inside out, and in which characters would be meeting in scenes that they couldn't possibly realistically meet in, like each other's dreams, and so on. Yeah. So one of the things that happens in that play is that I think the lessons of a kind of plaguiness come home to the texture of what's going on, in addition to just its themes and events.
Yeah, and I like that we're going sort of step by step outwards from the text to more the subtext. And what I want to talk about now, just while we have the time, is kind of the actual art of being a professional, if that makes sense, and how plague impacts upon that. Because you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation how different theatre companies in Shakespeare's time, some survived the plague time, some had to shut down, had to sell their scripts, all that kind of stuff. Yep. And some of them had to try and find innovative ways to keep going, to flee the city and tour the countryside, make money that way. And it does strike me that we've been seeing lately, over the last couple of years, incredible innovation in the artistic scene in terms of online theatre or the immersive kind of theatre that plays over Zoom calls or whatever. And I'm interested, a lot of people, I don't know necessarily this is me, argue that theatre is a good show of capitalism because it breeds innovation, and capitalism breeds artistic innovation. And if I was playing devil's advocate here, I might argue that plague times are the best expression of that, in that the business drive to keep having to make money, even during times of crises, creates more innovative behavior. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that's actually a very hard question, but a very interesting one. I don't think Shakespeare's theatre was especially innovative in response to the outbreaks of plague. I would have to think more carefully about that. But I mean, it was a very hungry theatre to begin with. You're absolutely right about that. And it was very interested in following down any lead for what would bring in an audience. So you find new fashions popping up and flowering very, very quickly, and boundaries being pushed all the time in this theatre. And indeed, some of the playwrights and players overstepped some of the boundaries, sometimes got themselves thrown in jail, particularly for getting a bit too satiric about the government, or about ambassadors who had diplomatic immunities and so on. I can't think of any particular a stylistic innovation that has to do with plague in English theatre. I probably have to take a bit longer to reflect on that. It may be, though, that on the continent, the mobility of the Italian actors, the commedia dell'arte actors, was not unrelated to the occasional necessity of them upping sticks as quickly as possible and moving down the road to another town where there wasn't plague. They had to be highly mobile and to take all of their ready materials with them as quickly as possible. And so their development of an improvisational theatre, which could be done at the drop of a hat in any available space with a minimum amount of fuss and a maximum amount of professional portability, that may well have to do with plague outbreaks in the 16th century in Italy. I would have to look into that and ask some friends of mine who know more about that theatre. Shakespeare's company moved into its indoor theatre at the end of the first decade of the 17th century, though that isn't particularly innovative or related to plague, because they'd been wanting to do that for about 10 or 12 years, and they'd been prevented by local planning and resource consent ordinances and by the desire of the local neighbours not to have disreputable adult actors crowding the streets with shonky audiences and so on.
That is depressingly relatable.
Yes, it is rather. But I can't think of anything really. I'd have to think quite hard. There's a certain temperature or mood of grimness about much of the theatre work of the first decade of that century. There's a lot of revenge tragedy. There's a lot of
the 16th century,
the
17th
first decade of the 17th century. There's a lot of satiric tragedy. There's a lot of blackness. There's a lot of grumpiness and bitterness. But it would be quite hard to tie that, I think, to any particular kind of public health emergency. I've seen, just to go down that road a slightly different way, some very interesting, very innovative stuff in the last couple of years coming over the internet. I've seen some fairly bad stuff too, but if I could just plug a local company, the Auckland Theatre Company's production of The Seagull, which is still up on YouTube in 4 episodes, one for each act, for my money was the best piece of theatre to adapt and make a virtue of necessity during the lockdown by making the disconnections among the characters of that play into mediatizing them, as it were, making their attempts to get in touch with one another or to have meaningful conversations or to connect into or expressing the difficulties around that by putting the different plot lines up on Zoom, on text messages, on Facebook posts, and so on. I thought that was tremendously impressive work, and I've said that to friends and colleagues all around the world and directed them to going and watching those. I saw some less successful things too, but that was an instance. It only works really if you can find a figurative connection that makes the medium that's being used to stage the drama part of the texture of what's going on, rather than just a crutch. Because we can't do it live, we have to do it this way. If you can find some internal reason for doing it this way rather than another way, that begins to make it interesting.
I like that, and I think, just looking at the time, I will start to wrap us up, but I do like that even in our lockdown episode, I like that we end up with a recommendation for some Auckland theatre, as we normally do.
It really was. I went into it with some misgivings because I had seen bad Zoom theatre, but very, very early on it became clear that this had been done very cleverly and with a full extension of the actors who were working in it in a way that really made sense of what they were trying to do. They weren't avoiding the issue by going online. They were actually making the issues plainer as well as more interestingly complex by going online.
Nice. Well, you hear that, audience? A recommendation from
Go
Tom
for
Bishop,
it.
as we call
Still
it.
there. Go find it.
As we call in the business, the gold star recommendation. Well, Tom, thank you very much for coming on the show for the first time. We really appreciate it. And thank you, audience, for watching. I hope you are all looking after yourself.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah,
Thank you, Sam. All
weird,
audience members, please be safe.
It's a weird time, and as I said, a bit rough around the edges of this episode. So much love to the editors and behind the scenes team. I'm sure they will. They're where the talent is in this team anyway. So I just much love to them as always. Tom, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And audience, we will see you next time. Goodbye.
You've turned your microphone off, Sam. I can't hear you.
Hello? I think, oh no, you turned your sound off to stop incoming sounds on
Still
your...
no sound. I can't hear a word. Yeah, okay.